through a personal invitation from Christine to give the Woolston Home Memorial Lecture this year. And to start with, Stanley Woolstonholme was a very close colleague and friend, particularly in the period after he joined the staff of the Proctor Department of Food and Leather Science in 1970. Roughly the time that I became the first secretary, I was secretary of the society, and it was great value, much of the information that he was able to give to me. Stanley was always very generous with his help and his advice to younger colleagues, and this was certainly true in my case. And we went to many international conferences together, and I learned a lot from him. Stanley was a great supporter of this society, particularly the activities of the Northern Group. I'm sure that he would have been as fascinated by the unfolding story of the Mary Rose as I've become. Secondly, Christine asked if I would talk about the Mary Rose, and my involvement with the Mary Rose actually began in this institution when it was then college, not the University of Northampton. At that time I was head of the Department of Leather Studies, and at that time you might remember that the Mary Rose was still entombed in silt under 40 to 45 feet of water in the Solent off South Sea, about 1.5 miles from the entrance to Portsmouth Harbour. The then director, Dr. Eric Ogilvie, who was always interested in making sure that the college kept in the limelight, said to me, "We must get involved with this, Peter, and will you contact the Mary Rose Trust?" Which I did, and as they say, the rest is history. I've now been involved for 32 years, and this is something around the 200th talk that I've given to various groups over the years. This was not only to raise money, which was extremely important at the time, because the Mary Rose project has been virtually entirely funded by public donation and by money that's come from industry direct, or in fact from many of the city livery companies. The Mary Rose had no direct government funds, although recently the new museum, which has just opened in 2013 at a cost of about £35 million, 21 million of that came from the Lottery Heritage Fund. So again, it's all partly money that we've raised by gambling on the lottery, and a very good source of income it's proved to be. I believe that the trust has been successful. The new museum, and that's really one of the things I want to mention and encourage people to go to. The new museum is fantastic, and I'm going to say just a little about that later on. But if you do want to think about going this year to the new museum, you must go down before September, because the museum's been closed for 4 or 5 months from September. The final stages of putting the ship on display later this year, the drying out process, the last stage of conservation of the ship will be completed, and all the drying ducting and all that's being removed, and the hot box that she sits in is being dismantled, and then the ship will be in the museum, and the visitors will be able to actually walk down the walkways and look at the ship directly, whereas now you have to look at it as if you're looking through one of those building sites with little windows that have been cut in the hot box. So this is the story of the Mary Rose. It starts with a young king. Now I've got to make certain that I can. No. Now that's a good start, isn't it? Henry VIII was crowned just 4 days before his 18th birthday, and this is not a picture you very often see of Henry. And it's the story of Henry VIII, and it's the story of his fighting ship that he commissioned to be built within a few months of his coronation. Henry had inherited 5 or 6 ships from his father, Henry VII, and a large fortune. And he set about strengthening and protecting his kingdom by building ships, establishing foundries for making and casting bigger guns, by building coastal defences, and by establishing alliances through marriage. He married Catherine of Aragon, daughter of the King of Spain, and he married off his sister, Princess Mary Tudor, to the aging Louis XII of France. So he established good support. When Henry died in 1547, some 18 months after the Mary Rose sank, he passed on to his successor a fleet of 50 fighting ships, of which 20 were great ships, over 1,000 tons. And he also passed on 3 dockyards at Portsmouth, Woolwich and Deptford, and a Navy department, an Admiralty department with 5 full-time staff. So, coming back to Henry, he didn't waste any time. He had one of his father's ships, Sovereign, rebuilt, and the keels of 2 further ships were laid down, all before the end of 1509, the year in which his coronation was. And one of those ships was the Mary Rose, a 4-masted carrack, listed as 600 tons. We don't have any idea of how she was built. There are no plans of how she was built. And the first picture that we actually have is some 30 years or so after the Mary Rose was built. And this is a picture from the Anthony roll, which was a roll produced by Anthony, who was a Minister of Ordnances at the Tower of London. And in 1546, he produced a list of 58 ships which were owned by Henry, and each ship, there was a drawing, and also the armaments, the guns, the bows, the bowstrings, the numbers of arrows, the number of shots that were aboard the ship at the time were also listed. That proved very interesting when the Mary Rose was raised, to be able to compare what was found aboard the ship when she was raised in what we think she was given when she first set sail and after she was rebuilt in 1536. We know now that in fact she looked quite a bit different. Her castles weren't so high, and she didn't have quite so many guns. She had a gun deck. These are pointing gone now, so that's not good. She had a gun deck here with 7 guns which could fire broadsides. She was built at Portsmouth, and in fact she was built in the earliest dry dock, the only dry dock at that time known anywhere in the world. And since that building, she's now in this dry dock here. I've lost the this dry dock here in purple, which is where the Mary Rose now is, and she's right next to HMS Victory, very, very appropriate position for her. This was a time of transition in shipbuilding. The earlier carracks of the 15th century were clinker style of building, and up here, the clinker style is where the planks of the ship were overlapping. And around about the turn of the beginning of the 16th century, ships were started to be built with the carbon type of building smooth interlocking planks. This made it much easier for gun port doors to be fitted into the ship and for them to be sealed, so that when the ship was underway, there was less danger of water getting in through the gun port doors. And this is a picture here of the very smooth-sided of the Mary Rose with the gun port doors here, the rebaited doors which enabled the gun lids to drop down and make close seals when the ship was underway. And this is an illustration actually of one of the gun port doors in the Mary Rose itself. So it was possible at this time then to put to have heavier guns and to put them lower down into the ship. Guns were getting bigger and heavier all the time. So if they stayed mounted in the castles, which they were in the early stages of shipbuilding, the ship would have become much more unstable and more difficult to sail. Putting the gun port down lower in the ship lowered the centre of gravity and made the ship easier to handle. The problem was that it was a bit of a gilt-edged sword, because if the ship was at sea, the gun port doors were open, then if the ship for any way was heeled over, then water could come in through the open gun port doors and the ship could turn turtle and sink. And this is what we believe probably happened at the time of the Mary Rose. We know that she was heavily laden with guns, that she probably had more men aboard than she was designed for, and probably lying very low in the water. Some people say only about 18 inches between the level of the sea and the lower gun port doors. And very difficult sailing in the solids anyway, and we believe that water came through the ship, into the ship, and she heeled over and sank very quickly. Also, the ship would have been covered with anti-boarding netting, and so when she sank, that would have stopped those who were on board the ship getting off. And we believe that of the ship's crew, only about 40 people actually survived getting off the ship. We know as well that the Mary Rose was refitted in Portsmouth in 1536 when she was listed as 700 tons. It was thought perhaps that she may have been converted at that time from this clinker style to the smooth-sided ship, but we now believe that she was actually originally built as a smooth-sided ship, a cardinal-type ship. The refit may just have been to strengthen the decks to enable the ship to carry more and heavier guns. There's no doubt that Henry was immensely proud of the Mary Rose. The choice of name is probably highly symbolic, combining a reference to his younger sister Mary and the Virgin Mary, and the Tudor Rose and the Virgin symbol of the mystic rose. These two together were probably in Henry's mind when he had the ship named. Sir Edward Howard, Lord High Admiral, used the Mary Rose as his flagship during the first of Henry's French wars, and in a letter to the King in 1513 he wrote about the Mary Rose, "The flower, I trow, of all the ships that ever sailed." After the first French war, the Mary Rose was laid up in reserve at Deptford, and at that time she carried as many as 40 large guns, 6 or 7 bronze guns, and 34 or 35 iron guns. So even at that early days, she was a formidable fighting ship. In 1520, the Mary Rose escorted Henry VIII across the Channel to the famous meeting with the French King Francis I at the Field of the Cloth of Gold to express everlasting friendship with the King. Concord didn't last long. Henry reneged on an agreement, and the Second French War broke out in 1522. In that same year, the Pope conferred on Henry the title Defender of the Faith. So it's interesting that a picture of one of the guns. Interesting that many of the guns that came out from the Mary Rose. This is one of the guns at Denby Calgary from the castle deck. She has cartouche, and on it says, Henry VIII, by the grace of God, King of England and France, Defender of the Faith, Lord of Ireland, and in earth of the English Church, Supreme Head. And this gun, in 1537, after Henry had broken with Rome and declared himself head of the church in England. Also, it carries the note that this gun, Robert and John Owen, brethren born in the city of London, the sons of an Englishman, made this bastard, that non-standard cannon, in 1537. And this is aboard and many of the guns. A later gun, actually, when Henry became head of the church in Ireland, also says, instead of just head of the church in England, it also includes head of the church in Ireland. So he wasn't wasting any opportunity to say who he was. After the end of the Second French War in 1525, the Mary Rose was mothballed again for 10 years until 1536. And in 1536 she was rebuilt because guns were getting larger. In the early stages, the size of the guns probably nothing much above about a ton or so. When the Mary Rose was refitted in 1536, she was able to carry much larger guns, and some of them were up to a weight of 2.5 tons. She's listed in the Anthony Roll list as having 91 muzzle and breech loading guns, 15 bronze, of which only 10 were found when the Mary Rose was raised, and 76 iron guns, of which 29 were found. 30 of these guns were big enough to need carriages, whereas in the early ship, only 6 or 7 had to be were needed to be carried on a carriage. The crew in 1536 was said to be 200 mariners, 185 soldiers who would have been archers and pikemen, and 30 gunners, making a total of 415. But this would have been the complement under normal times, when you were at war. The number of personnel aboard would have been enhanced by more soldiers. On the 19th of July, 1545, during the Battle of the Solent, while acting as flagship of the fleet, George Carew, the Mary Rose sank some 1 mile south of Southsea Castle. This is difficult, but the top picture is part of a very famous picture called the Cowdrey engraving. It shows the French fleet coming around the Isle of Wight. The lower one shows the English fleet just coming out of Portsmouth Harbour. The Mary Rose in this picture has sunk here, and there are a few bodies floating in the water here. And this is the top of Southsea Castle, and this is one of Henry's great ships, the great King Harry. And here's some survivors standing on the top of the mast here and being some being saved by small boats coming out from the shore. And this picture shows Henry VIII down here watching the fight from Southsea Castle. The ship, when she went down, she hit the soft silt, going through the soft silt layer, and she went down in about 40 or 45 feet of water, and she was at 60 degrees to the vertical, and this was an artist's impression of what the ship may have looked like when she first went onto the seabed. Well, after the ship went down, some salvaging was done, and we know that the masts of the ship would have been removed, and some small guns, and all the sails. A ship like the Mary Rose would have had about 12,000 square feet of sails and 10 miles of rope. And more than 1,000 rigging blocks would have been needed on the sails to sail a ship of the size of the Mary Rose. That's what she looked like. The starboard side of the ship is on the seabed and was protected. The port side of the ship was subjected to the action of the waves. And what happened then was that over the following years, as I just mentioned here, this was George Carew. He was the Vice Admiral aboard the Mary Rose. He's the only person who we know and actually have a picture of. The port side of the ship was more rigorously exposed to the violence of storms and strong currents and the ravages of marine organisms and disturbance by passing ships. The exposed port side gradually collapsed. Heavier items, guns attached to their carriages, metal objects, stone shot, etc. fell into the ship and were then later covered up by the silt coming into the into the ship. We also believe that we have, although not many men, names were not known, we also think that we know the name of the cook who was aboard the ship. From articles that were found in the galley area, we think that his name was Nye Coop. And this is the facial reconstruction using these modern facial reconstruction techniques. And this has been done for a number of other people aboard the Mary Rose, the purser and the archer, and the same has been done for several other people who were aboard. And interestingly, a dog. The bones of a dog was found outside the carpenter's cabin, and that has also been reconstructed. And it was named Hatch by a local school, Whitgift School in Croydon, who were given the honour of choosing a name for this dog. And called him Hatch. Coming back, this shows the situation of the ship once she was sunk. Here she is on the. Sorry, Christine. The top one shows the ship, the water things coming into the ship, silt and sand. The so particularly dirty bit of water, and silt and sand and things like that would come in through the open hatches, through the gun port doors, and This is one of the things that saved so many articles amongst the Mary Rose, because they were sealed in the silt and sand, and anaerobic conditions built up inside the ship, so that the organic materials inside the ship were protected. They weren't attacked so much by anaerobic organisms and organic matter and organic life that might have attacked them under normal circumstances. As time went by, the port side of the ship collapsed because you had ships going over, dropping their anchors, tangling up with the superstructure of the ship, and the port side of the ship was pulled apart, and guns and other things fell both inside the ship, again to be covered later, or they fell into these scour pits here which built up around the ship. And then as the years went by, a new permanent seabed of crushed shells and clay was built up over the ship, so that it was sealed under a new seabed and lost. And it was only when you occasionally had heavy storms that the seabed was broken up and disturbed, that the beam ends of the decking could be seen. And that's what in fact happened. The ship lay on the seabed for nearly 300 years, until in 1836, the Dean brothers, who were pioneer divers, after a particularly heavy storm, were looking for to salvage ships in the Solent, and they came across the ship, and they did dives on the ship over 4 years, and brought up three cannons, which are, one of them now is in the Tower of London, and we also know that she brought up a breech-loading iron gun. The bronze cannons, beautifully made. If you go to the Mary Rose Museum, wonderful cast bronze cannons which have been cleaned. They would have been muzzle loaded. They would have been loaded down the muzzle, and the gun would have had to have been on a big carriage with wheels, because it would have had to have been pulled back after firing to be washed out and reloaded. Whereas the iron breech-loading guns, they had a breech, and each gun had a number of these, and they were loaded prior to the gun being fired. So they could just be lifted out, a new breech dropped back in, and then fired again. So they fired much faster than the bronze guns. This is interesting. This is a notice from the Dean brothers saying, relics from Mary Rose at Spithead, under the water for 295 years. We, the undersigned Dean and Edwards, do hereby certify that this particular piece of equipment purchased at our public sale on the 12th of November 1840 at Portsmouth. And then it says that they were from the Mary Rose, sunk in the reign of Henry VIII while forming the line of battle with the English fleet at Spithead in defence of Portsmouth against the attack of a formidable French squadron in the year 1545, by which event Sir George Carew, her commander, and about 600 men suddenly perished. After the Dean brothers finished their diving in 1860, the site of the Mary Rose was left untouched and forgotten until in 1965 Alexander McGee and a team of amateur divers started to search archives for the lost ship. This project was called Solent Ships, and using sonar devices the position of the ship was located, and the Mary Rose 1967 committee was formed a three-dimensional plan of the wreck site was produced, and the relevant area of the seabed was leased from the Crown Estates. During 1969-70, a trench was dug across the site, and a wrought iron breech loading gun was raised. The committee managed a programme of exploration and survey which was carried out entirely by volunteer divers. During this time they were able to show that timbers below the level of the seabed were well preserved, that though most of the port side was found to have collapsed through mechanical erosion of the exposed timbers, the starboard side was in good condition. The Mary Rose Society had been set up in 1978, and because of all these wonderful things that the divers were finding down in the ship, they felt justified in setting up the Mary Rose Trust in 1979, a registered charity under the presidency of His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales, who made several dives on the ship subsequent to that. And the main objectives of the Trust were to find, record, excavate, raise, bring ashore, preserve, publish, report and display for all time in Portsmouth the Mary Rose. And most of these objectives are now at the stage of being realised. Over the following 3 years, from 79 to 82, thousands of dives, more than 25,000 were made on the wreck, and more than 10 man-years was spent on the seabed raising artefacts and bringing them back to Portsmouth for conservation and preparing them for display. The ship was filled with hundreds of tons of sand and silt. In fact, 200 lorry loads of silt had to be removed from the ship. And every ounce of silt and sand inside the ship was removed using an airlift pump and dispatched well away from the ship. Every handful of sand and silt was fed into the bottom of the lift pump, so that nothing that was within the sand and the silt would be, was lost. And so hundreds of artefacts were found in this way, from very, very small ones, a dice which was only about 6 or 7 millimetres cubed. And each of these individual items were found, they were photographed, they were drawn, and they were given unique numbers. And there were 19,000 of these objects found. If you go into the Mary Rose Trust and look at the rows and rows and rows of boxes of photographs and drawings and information for each of these items, it's been a huge exercise which has been going on now since she was raised in lost my track. We'll look at some of these objects. Here's another picture of another diver. The conditions under the water were very poor. You couldn't see maximum of about 6 metres, and sometimes no distance at all. So people working on the ship couldn't see other people working on the ship very often. They spoke to each other by radio underwater and kept in touch. This one is not too much light. This, in fact, is one of the it's the end of a gun on the gun carriage. A bit too light to see that. Here's the gun being lifted from the Mary Rose and being loaded onto a support vessel close by. is 4 dice and dominoes, very small objects which were found and could easily be lost. And there may well be other items there. Other dives are being done from time to time, although it's an expensive job, and the silt and sand is still being looked at and examined. Here we have a leather dice shaker, the shaker that would have been used with the dice. This is a wonderful leather-bound book. The paper, the cellulose, and the cloth and things like that on board the ship, obviously they disintegrated. But the leather binding here is beautiful to look at, on display in the museum. Wonderful on embossings and on the binding, and then a picture. Each object would have also been drawn. There would be a graphic representation of what was on the leather, and they're really great to look at. It still amazes me that they were under the water for 435 years. It just seems impossible. Here's a wonderful leather bottle here with a stopper. Wonderful wooden bowl here that the ordinary seaman would have used. The officers would have had pewter, but the ordinary seaman had wooden bowls. Many of them, of course, wouldn't have been able to read, and so the object just has an identification mark on the wooden vessel indicating ownership. And these are the dagger handles. The thin iron of the dagger has corroded and gone, but the dagger handle, many of those found. And this is a drawing, a sketch of the leather bottle showing the design that was on the bottle, and in this case the stopper's being taken out to show the appearance of the stopper in the leather water bottle. Oh, more than here's some leather ankle boots, still with the laces. And photographed again with this lovely bottle here. Over 400 shoes were found amongst the remains that were raised. Some 179, 180 skulls were found aboard the ship and raised together with a great variety of bones which have been examined over recent years to give us a much greater idea of diseases and things like that may have been there amongst the ship's company, and that work is still ongoing. Well, after all the debris had been taken out of the ship, that's an impression of what was left in the ship, and the position, in fact, of some of the guns on the gun deck. But this decking was still in place, and was ultimately completely removed before the ship was raised to lower its weight. And here is a picture of shows those parts of the ship that were lost. They collapsed, and also the port side has gone as well. And so this is what you actually see of the ship now. These bits have gone, although in 2005 the bow stem here, this bit which gives an idea of how the bow is shaped, was raised, along with another anchor. So we've got 3 anchors have been found and raised. This is just a similar view of the ship that just indicates this was the upper deck, this was the stern castle, the back of the ship. The bow castle was gone, but as well as the decks, there were also a carpenter's cabin here, a barber surgeon's cabin here, a pilot's cabin here, and a galley. And the thing that's always amazed me is that the galley, I'll show you in a moment, had two huge cooking tureens and furnaces in the lower part of the ship, in the hold of the ship. That's too much information, but this just is an attempt to show where all the items were found. And here, barrels, hundreds of dozens and dozens and dozens of barrels all over the ship. They would have contained food, joints of meat, fish, all sorts of things. Here's the galley with these two huge tureens here and these furnaces for them. There are still hundreds of the barrels which have not been conserved or brought up because there were literally dozens of these staves, barrel staves, and they're still being, they're still to be conserved. Well, after the ship had been cleared out, the problem was to raise the ship, and this was a huge engineering exercise in its own right. But what happened was, here was the Mary Rose on the seabed. She'd been cleared out. All the decking and the cabin structures and things had been taken out to reduce the weight to a minimum. And they then put this lifting unit over the ship and connected this lifting cradle here to the ship. Then the cradle, using a huge crane on the surface, the ship was lifted and placed in this support cradle, which was just to the side of the Mary Rose. And the support cradle had rubber cushions inside, which were filled with air to give you the shape of the ship, so that she could be slotted into this shape, so water actually filled underneath here. And then the whole thing was latched together and lifted, and it was weighed about 580 tons at this stage, and it had to be lifted out of the water. And that shows the first picture of her coming out of the water. This huge crane, which was Tom Moore, which had been lifting the ship, and she was put onto a barge called Tor 1. Those of you who, like I did, watched this exercise being carried out on the 11th of October. One of these supports, this one here, collapsed, and as the ship was being raised, we thought that what for 435 years on the seabed had achieved might have been achieved by technology when they were trying to raise the ship. But fortunately, the others held, and the ship was safely raised. She then sailed into number 3 dry dock, and in the dock she was immediately started to be sprayed with water. The most important thing was that the ship was saturated with with seawater, and she couldn't be allowed to dry out because it was wet wood, some of it was degraded, and they had to keep it wet while this hall was being built around her. The first time I went, only a few months after the Mary Rose was raised, the only way you could see her was by walking over this cantilever bridge at the far end, and you had to go through an airlock in order to get in, because they were so concerned that microorganisms, fungi and wood-eating organisms would be brought into the ship from outside. So you went into an airlock and the air was evacuated, and it was quite an exercise. And this was done with the public as well, and so the numbers of people that could get into the ship in the day was very small, and if you went down there were queues and queues of people waiting to go into the ship. This shows another picture, but again shows how they've started to build up a viewing platform, so that after a few years you were able to go and walk down the whole length of the ship and look at her. She stayed at this angle of 60 degrees to the vertical for a couple of years before she was then pulled up into the upright position. And I remember going to the Mary Rose and being able to stand down here, and she was sprayed with 3,000 gallons of water an hour at a temperature of between 2 and 5 degrees centigrade for 20 hours a day. And all the people who worked on her inside had to work in protective clothing, and standing down at the bottom, and there wasn't a huge amount of light in the ship, and this was just dripping with water. It was like some sea monster that had come out of the deep. And it was quite an eerie experience. And these are the decking knees to support the decking. So the first thing the trust had to do was to put the decking and stuff back into the ship prior to so all the deck planking could be washed as well. And here you see men working in waterproofs. They built a little railway along the side of the ship so that they could bring the deck planking. 3,300 of them or so there were. This is an archer up here giving you some idea of the scale of the ship. And that was really quite exciting to be there and seeing all the deck planking being replaced. The ship was also supported with titanium bars during this reconstruction and early conservation stage. This is an artist's impression now, just skipping forward, of the Mary Rose Museum, the new Mary Rose Museum. The old museum, which was open for about 30 years, had about 8 million visitors in that time, but she could only display something like about 6 to 7% of the number of artefacts that came up with the ship. So only about 1,200 to 1,500 of the articles that came up were actually in display. In the new museum, it's 40 to 50% at the moment. There's some 8,000 objects on display, and they're hoping that as the museum develops, that they will be able to display more of them. So here's this is the museum. This is the entrance hall, and there's a cafe in there now, as you would expect, and the sales area selling books and things like that. And here's the picture. And the Mary Rose is now only a few hundred yards from where she was built in the original dry dock. This shows a picture from above, and this is the ship here. At the moment, she's in this big box being dried out, and the display galleries are along the side here, and you walk at 3 you walk at 3 levels here. So here's the ship with its decking, and here's the display. Here's the area where people can look, and they can look across at the ship, and then they can turn round and look at the guns and the artefacts and the things like that that were raised from each section of the ship on display. So they can actually see the guns that would have been here on the gun deck. And they can look across there and see those same guns where they were positioned on the ship when the Mary Rose was before she sank. And you do this at 3 levels: the deck level, the main gun deck, and down here enable you to look at the orlop deck and what's in the hold and what's in the storage deck here. This is the shop, and the other side of the Mary Rose they have an education block. One of the things which has got a lot of money for the Mary Rose is that she now gives training courses for GCSE and A-level students. Up to 30,000 students a year go through the training, and they do all sorts of historical, social history, marine history in the Mary Rose, and they have some very good, very nice laboratories and things there now, and in the new ship hall. And this is not very. This shows the inside, which is quite dark. And this is the ship when she would finally conserve, and the final drying finishes in 2 or 3 months' time. And this is the viewing gallery in the new museum. And I think this in the new museum shows the gun deck, and the guns in position as they would have been on the original ship. Bronze-loaded cannons on their carriages, and breech-loading iron guns with the cannonballs, the shot and stuff like that that would be associated with the ship. I go down quite often, and they've actually put some notices up inside the ship hall to tell people that every item that they see on display was actually on the Mary Rose and actually raised, because when people go, they cannot believe that all these objects are actually real, that they haven't been made or manufactured. They are real. They really have been under the water. They really were under the water for more than 400 years and have been raised and conserved and put on display. The only thing that isn't real is that some of the knives where the iron, the action part, has corroded away. They've made perspex inserts to slot into the wooden handle so that you get an idea of what the sword looked like or what the dagger looked like. But it's only those perspex bits which didn't actually come up from the Mary Rose. So, the Mary Rose is there, and this ship sank. 400, 500, 600 men lost their lives, and when they died, they had all their personal possessions with them. So, from the point of view of social history and naval history, this is fantastic. In fact, it's a time capsule of Tudor England, because we know that nothing aboard that ship is later than 1545. And so it's producing a huge amount of information about how men, and they were all men, how men lived aboard a fighting ship. And these were not men like in the time of Nelson's, who were forced to join. These were people who were trained as seamen. It was their job. They were given, they were allowed incredible amount, mention it in a minute, incredible amounts of food. They were allowed 8 pounds of beef a week, £1 of beef a day and a bit extra on Sunday. They were allowed fish and cheese and butter. They were allowed 8 gallons of beer a week. Now, it was only 1.5%, 2% alcohol, but they were allowed, this was what they were allowed from what a ship like the Mary Rose had to carry. And this was laid down almost by statute. So, they were quite well looked after. So you need to have a look at then some of the other objects quickly to finish. Here's a wonderful shoe. This is one of the first things that I saw, and it amazed me that this has been on the seabed for 400 plus years. It's a very early type of welded construction. It would have been black when it came up because it would have been stained black by the reaction of the bent hands and the iron, which is in the ship from the degrading iron. And it was cleaned with chelating agents before it was conserved. This is not very easy. This is a tool holder, simply a rectangular leather, first of all coiled round a former and stitched up, and it would have been something that the carpenter would have had a tool on the belt. There were 6 of these were found. This is a wonderful bag handle. It's a wooden handle. You can't see the leather. It has 4 triangular strips of leather attached to it. Here, it has this wonderful woven plaited handle which wraps around leather piece which wraps around the handle, and that's what it looks like. And onto these pieces would have been attached a cloth bag, and into the cloth bag would have been the money that the purser had, and he would have carried it round the ship like that, enabling him to change money, because all these people would have been gambling, and they had all sorts of, they played backgammon and things of that sort. They had these dice, so they would have needed money to be changed. And he was the purser was also the money changer. The money changer as well. These wonderful apothecary scales, or apothecary balance for weighing out medication, and also possibly for the person would have had something like this as well in order to weigh coins, because they were always clipping bits off, basing the currency. When I was down in Mary Rose the last time, just over 3 weeks ago, I actually handled an Edward II gold coin, which is insured for £50,000. When Edward II came to the crown, they were 99.9% pure gold. The same sorts of angels, these were called angels, at Henry VIII time, the amount of gold had fallen to about 92%. So he was removing some of the gold and replacing it with other things. No one ever loses a trick. This was one of a pair of mittens, sheepskin, which were, you can see the holes here and here, where this would be folded over and stitched around the side. Just one of a pair of mittens. Bellows, which would have been down in the, which would have been used to help fire the kilns. And here's one of these huge cooking kilns. There were 2 of these. There were 2,000 bricks associated with building these kilns. And I remember speaking to one conservator at the state, you know, we had to treat and conserve and clean every single one and record its weight and information about it, and then rebuild it. And you can see down in the new museum a picture of how they actually found the kiln on the bottom deck and how it actually lay and how the bricks had all been displaced. And down here we have shovels, wooden shovels down here for stoking the fire, and wooden bowls for taking the soup and stuff out of the tureen and putting them into the bowls. By statute, the meat had to be capable of being eaten and kept in barrels for a year. So when it had been there a long time and used, it could be pretty, well, you can imagine what it might have been like a year in a barrel. And it was also served with pulses. So you can imagine 400 or 500 men on board a ship eating meat, that some of it which might have been a bit rancid, laced with peas and things like that. And flatulence that was going on inside this ship with 500 or 600 men. This is why many, I'll show you in a moment, many of the men had a spice grinder, and lots of peppercorns were found, because peppercorn was a treatment at the time, apart from putting it in your food. It was also used as a treatment for flatulence, which was a real problem on a ship of this sort. This is one of my favourites. This is a sundial pocket watch, or a sundial watch. You can see it on your hand. It's about the size of the 50p piece, just a bit bigger. And it has a gnomon. I never remember how to spell it. I think it's G-N-O-M-O-N. This piece here, which is raised to cast a shadow, and there would have been a magnetised iron needle in here, and as long as the sun was shining, you could set your time by the sun. About 5 or 6 of these were found. Beautiful. This was a gimbal, a compass mounted on gimbals, one of the first that was known anywhere. This is another wonderful one. The backgammon board with inlays in yew, and the light ones are yew and the darker ones are larch or spruce, and they have some counters here as well. You can see it would be quite easy to miss those in several hundreds of tons of silt and sand in board the ship. This is why everything had to be done so carefully, and why it took so long. Over 25,000 dives were made on the ship, and 10 man-years of time spent excavating it. This is a draft board. They weren't coloured black and white. The black spaces had an indent in them, so you knew which the black and the white squares were. 2 more of these pocket watches, a protractor here, and a divider, a pair of dividers, measuring compasses. As well as these sort of things, they also involved in pastimes. They played music, and here we've got some musical items. There were 3 tabor pipes, drumsticks, and this sort of fret from a violin, and there were also some drums, tabors covered with, which would have been covered with parchment. And this is a lovely little thing there. It's a carved spine which would have been on the back of a book. Beautiful, beautiful thing, out of ivory. That's not a very good one, sorry about that. This is a shawm. They found a shawm, which is the forerunner of the oboe. This couldn't be played, but a reconstruction of this was made, and if you went to the early museum, you could actually hear music from the time of Henry VIII being played on an instrument reconstructed to take the shape of this shawm. Arrow bows. Although there were these large guns, also a lot of fighting went on in the ship with bows and arrows. And 179 longbows and over nearly 4,000 arrows were found. And these longbows, well, these longbows were longbows for real men. It took, on average, 90 to 100 pounds to draw one of these, but some of them it took 150 to 160 pounds to draw one. If you got hit with an arrow fired under that sort of pressure, you knew you'd been hit. Can't see this very well, I apologise. Boxes and boxes of arrows. You can't actually see, but the arrows also, all the action part of the arrow, the metal heads had all corroded away. But you could see the black marks left by the iron arrowheads had reacted with the tan at the end of the arrows and had stained the end of the arrows black. These arrows were large enough so that the bow could be drawn 30 inches. It was a formidable piece of fighting equipment, the longbow, but of course it couldn't, in the end, stand against the handgun or the gun, because an arrow was moving at about 100 miles an hour, whereas a gun from a handgun was travelling at 1,000 miles an hour. So in the end, as a weapon of war, the bow and arrow eventually couldn't hold its own. But at the time of Mary Rose, they were formidable weapons. We'll talk the barrels, because there were dozens and dozens of those. This is another wonderful exhibit. This is the contents of the barber surgeon or surgeon barber's chest. Ointment jars here. Wonderful wooden ointment containers. They would have had salves in them. And it was inside this salve, when the lid was taken off one of these, you could actually see the fingerprints of the last person who put their hand in to the bottom and drawn the salve up the side to apply it to a wound on one of the men. There would have also been bowls here for shaving and also for bleeding bowls. A mallet. One youngster, when I went to a school, said for putting them to sleep before they chopped off something. And a syringe, a urethral syringe. Many of the men aboard ship would have had venereal disease, and this was the syringe. And when I gave a talk once to a young wives group, one of them said, "Well, it served him right, didn't it?" But this was about, the need. You wouldn't want to be stuck with this urethral syringe with the needle. Here's the combs. There were very many, more than 80 of the combs were found. They're very important because they get stuffed with nits. Here's a nice little manicure set made out of ivory. I haven't got a picture of another piece that would have been with that. And one of these ivory bits would have had a little bowl on the end, and it was used for getting wax out of the out of the ears. But these are nice little manicure set. Commander. It would have been packed with leaves, nice sweet-smelling leaves, to make life a little bit better inside the ship. And this is always an interesting one. This is a hanger for a pocket. The traditional type of pocket was quite early, and you would have had a length of cloth stitched up and hung over this arm here, and then the metal belt round the waist, and then you could put your daily paper slot it in the top, or your sandwiches. This was the spice grinder. Quite a number of these were found. The surgeon barber wore a special sort of coif made of velvet, and one of those was found. dozens and dozens of wooden articles, buckets here, leather bucket and a wooden bucket here. Wonderful, I'll show you again here. Carpenter's plane. My father had planes like that. A ruler here, and wonderful set of wooden equipment. And these are some of the planes. There are a whole load of them. You know, I sold a load of these when my father died. He had about 200 different sorts of wood planes, and they were all, many of them were very similar to that. Yeah. Just finished that. This is the ship's bell, made specially for the Mary Rose in 1510. We slip those. Through. When you come to the cannons, very quickly, each cannon had a gauge like this, so that the cannonballs could be fed through the gauge before they were introduced into the muzzle, to make certain that they were the right fit, the right size for the muzzle. Hundreds of cannonballs. If you go down into the secondary collection at the Mary Rose, and I think some people are going to do that later in May, you can see shelves and shelves of these cannonballs, hundreds of them are found. And moulds for making them. Now, if I just skip through quickly, this is thimbles and things for making, for looking after the sails, and they would also have done weaving aboard the ship. I'll just go through right through to this was a collection of pewterware, which is in a display case, hundreds of pieces of pewter. I think this is the last one. And this is a lanthorn or lantern. And the space between the wooden uprights would have been filled with cattle horn, which had been scraped very, very thin, so that it gave some light. And the last one, I think, is... I can't get it. The last one, in fact, is one of the things that was a great joy to me was that because so many men lost their lives on the Mary Rose, a couple of years after the Mary Rose sank, the remains of one of the seamen was interred in the aisle of Portsmouth Cathedral, and you can go and see it. And we had a requiem. The other thing that I haven't mentioned, of course, is that although Henry had broken with Rome, most of the crew of the Mary Rose would have been Catholic and still practicing the Catholic faith. And so this service that we went to in Portsmouth Cathedral was done with the full rites of the time. Wonderful robes for war which were borrowed from the church in the United States, flamboyant and reds and purples and things like this. And the remains coffin of one of these the ship's company, Mary Rose, was interred in an aisle, and after the service, everybody who had been invited was given a sprig of rosemary to throw onto the coffin. And then you've got this bit that it says that the King's ship Mary Rose was lost and recovered on that date. Here lies a member of the ship's company of the Mary Rose. May they rest in peace. 19th of July 1984, when the service was held. Only a fraction of 19,000 objects. I hope that if you have the opportunity, and you haven't been, you'll take the opportunity to go to Portsmouth and see the new museum. I'm sure you'll be as thrilled with it and with the objects in it as I've been associated with it for now more than 30 years. Thank you.